the angels go back to heaven, what would they have heard, those shepherds? Heaven is sometimes closer to us than we think, and right now the frontier is extremely thin. Angels are here and the Lord is here. Since we have a good few little people, I'd like to indicate how the infant Jesus is far closer to you than you think. He was one of you. Children have a power over his heart, and strangely enough, this element of proximity, of closeness, was one of the things that puzzled the still very Anglican and academic John Henry Newman. In early life, actually, with his own father, he was at the time living in London. He happened to walk into a Catholic church, which is still there and which I know. It's now in the hands of the Ordinariate. That's the Anglicans who came over. It was, I believe, the church of the Portuguese embassy, and so tucked away somewhere in the middle of London. But they happened to walk in out of pure curiosity, and they were both very English, and that means stiff upper lip. But what was their surprise when they saw little people and children going up to statues, putting their arms round them, kissing them, and he saw for the first time what he called a holy familiarity with heaven, and he saw how different it was from his head knowledge. This was heaven touching earth, and the actual point of touching was the statue kissed. So the Lord likes to be kissed. Remember that, little people, it's actually Jesus you're kissing by what represents him. And when you put flowers, or when you decorate Our Lady, or anything which is holy, the Lord, heaven, earth, and all the angels are happy together, because this is the way we do it. As you might honour later in life pictures of your parents. It's as it were done to them, the way you place them in a nice place and don't forget them. And by the way, St. Teresa of Avila was given to understand, way back in the time of the Reformation, that one of the things that horrified heaven was that these were all taken away because of the Incarnation. It means that we have the right to use our body also physically to adore. Not to adore the thing, but to adore Jesus represented. One day, many years ago now, at the heart of the communist persecution in the Eastern Bloc, something happened which showed how much the Lord really listens to children, because children were involved. It was in those days when all the education system was geared towards cancelling God from the equation, making them indoctrinated atheists. And there was one girl in this class who was very well formed in her faith because probably of the grandparents, and she would not yield. And the other children were also aware of things, probably for the same reason, because things at home can be handed on, especially through the other generation. And by the way, grandparents do have that ministry. It's important that they hand on the faith which is weak sometimes in our time. Well, what happened? This teacher was always at this particular girl who had a faith which she didn't like. She would belittle her, berate her, and bully her, basically. But one day, the other one would not give in, because she was attacking also her Jesus. And in the class, the teacher came right at her and said, to all of them for that matter, okay, if he exists, tell him to show himself. the lassie got up on her chair and said, "We have a promise that where 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name and agree, it will be granted. Together, let's ask him." And they all, children now, cried out, "Come, Lord Jesus!" Suddenly, the door opened, and a great ball of magical light, beautiful beyond compare, came in, and in this great ball of light was a beaming child, smiling at the children and showing that he had very much heard. As discreetly as he had come, he went away, but the teacher was distraught. She ran to the principal and said what had happened. He got her seen to, and she was sent by the authorities to be sorted out in an asylum, but she never denied what she had seen. At the other end of the scale, you have the grown-ups. Some, like the saint in that picture there, died for what we're doing right now. You notice he has a host and a chalice. That was painted by a Benedictine of Greenwich Abbey. And the saint in question was St. John Roberts, who was a Benedictine, but Welsh and Welsh-speaking. He's actually from our area in the north of Wales. And he was celebrating in secret what we're doing now, a bit actually in the same way, sort of. And he had got to the end, nearly, but not quite. Suddenly there was a bang on the door, open up in the name of the king. A few days later, he was being hung, drawn and quartered. But there's another one which I'd like to talk about for a few seconds. It had happened earlier in time. No, actually later in time. That was in the Reformation. This one was in about a century and a half, or possibly 2 centuries later, in France. It went like this. I start from the end, and I go back to the front of the story because it's out of sync, but you'll see why in the end. In a monastery I know in England, there was a priest who had just been ordained. He wasn't a monk, he was a diocesan priest, but newly ordained, and he wanted to spend Christmas with the monks in Downside Abbey, big Benedictine Abbey near Bath. And there were many monks in the community, and the good monk, or rather priest, asked the good sacristan monk if he could have an altar to celebrate. Now in those days they used to have what we do now in separate celebrations. They could do it one after the other, 3 in 1. But now it's midnight dawn, the one we're doing now, and 11 o'clock or whatever. But a priest in those days could do all 3 together. Now, what happened was this. The sacristan had given all his chalices away because there were so many priests and altars, but there was one tiny altar, a bit discreet, he had left, and one tiny chalice. And so he gave it to the good young priest and pointed where the altar was. So at midnight he went off with himself, and on his own actually he celebrated. But something happened. He got as far as the offertory and started to hear noises, and they were getting louder. What's all this about? He couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't stop once he'd started. So he carried on, and the noise got louder and louder and became quite deafening. The elevation was really high, and he got as far as the Agnus Dei, and suddenly it all stopped. What was all that about? It was as though he could hear roars of insults and cruelty. Somebody passing by. Well, a bit puzzled, he got to the end of his celebration and went to bed. The following morning, the good sacristan came up to him and said, "How'd you get on last night?" But he had a twinkle in his eye. And the good priest said, "Well, actually, something very strange happened." "Oh, tell me about it." And he did. And the good sacristan said, "Well, actually, I was in a hurry last night. I didn't have time to explain to you. There's a story behind that chalice. It's called the persecution chalice. It's tiny. It was meant for those who had to celebrate in secret. That chalice has been used over the years. And it was used in France, when our fathers were in France, in exile, in the terror. And one priest who had just been ordained was in prison, and they had managed to get to him a tiny chalice to celebrate in his cell in secret. When he was doing so, at Christmas, somebody was being taken from another cell to the gallows, to the guillotine in France, to have his head chopped off. And when it got to the Agnus Dei, his head was chopped off and fell. And he understood what he was doing. He was doing what we're doing, what quite a few died for. This afternoon, after the liturgical events are all over, I go as every year to Friends Bath Boy, and not far from there, from the house, is a place where Father Barnwell, a good, holy priest, was on his horse, and he was going to say Holy Mass, and 4 strong men caught him, took him down from his horse, and hanged him because of what we're doing. Remember that. Next time, maybe you don't want to come to church. People have died for it, and sometimes been racked and tortured terribly.